I woke up to the antiseptic sting of the hospital air and the slow drip of a machine somewhere to my left, my body heavy and burning, like it didn't fully belong to me anymore. The ceiling lights were too bright, the sheets too white, and every breath felt borrowed. My wedding ring was gone, my phone untouched, and the silence beside my bed said more than any words ever could. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt that trust break while you were at your weakest, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this don't happen in isolation. I lay there counting cracks in the ceiling, realizing the pain in my side wasn't the worst of it. Something deeper had shifted, something irreversible. I didn't know yet who had decided my value was spent, or how close I was to losing more than a piece of myself. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I woke up to pain before I woke up to memory. My left side burned like it had been hollowed out, every breath scraping against something raw and broken. My name is Emily Carter, and as I lay there staring at a stained ceiling, I understood my marriage was already over. The room smelled sharp and cold, like disinfectant and metal. The bed was too narrow, the light too harsh. This was not the private recovery room my husband promised. There were no flowers, no footsteps, no familiar voice telling me everything was fine. Just a plastic curtain, distant coughing, and the steady reminder that my body had been opened and changed. I tried to move my arm and felt weakness instead of strength. Panic followed, slow and heavy. I kept waiting for Daniel to walk in, to explain why I was alone, why my phone was gone, why no one had said my name out loud. That was when the truth settled. Something had gone wrong, and it wasn't just the surgery. The loss felt deeper than pain alone. I drifted back into memory because pain has a way of dragging truth behind it. Before the hospital, before the marriage collapsed, I was a woman who learned early that belonging was never guaranteed. I grew up moving through foster homes, always packing and unpacking my life into boxes that never stayed closed for long. Some houses were kind, others cold, but none were permanent. I learned to be easy to love, quiet, helpful, grateful for whatever space I was allowed to occupy. What I wanted most was simple, a place where I was not temporary. When I met Daniel, he felt like stability. He listened when I spoke. He remembered small details about my past, and he made the future sound solid instead of uncertain. Being with him felt like stepping inside after years of standing in the cold. I relaxed in ways I didn't realize I had been holding back. There were moments I ignored, decisions he made quickly, opinions that carried more weight than mine. I told myself that compromise was part of partnership. I believed love meant adapting, smoothing edges, choosing harmony over discomfort. I clung to the relationship not because I was weak, but because it promised permanence. And once you have lived without roots, you will endure almost anything to keep from being uprooted again. That hunger to belong followed me quietly, all the way into his family, where I began to feel measured instead of welcomed. It was subtle at first, but the feeling of judgment settled in before I understood why there. Daniel's mother, Margaret, never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Her presence carried a quiet authority that filled every room before she did. From the beginning, I felt like I was standing on a marked line, though no one ever pointed it out to me. She watched how I set the table, how I dressed, how I spoke. Corrections came wrapped in politeness, comparisons disguised as stories about other women who had done things better, more gracefully, more appropriately. I told myself it was just adjustment, that joining a family meant learning its rhythms. So I tried harder. I cooked meals I'd never made before, smiled through discomfort, rehearsed conversations in my head so I wouldn't say the wrong thing. When something felt off, I assumed it was my fault. I believed effort could turn judgment into approval. The pattern repeated quietly. Nothing I did was openly wrong, yet nothing was ever quite enough. I was praised for being helpful, reliable, accommodating. Rarely for simply being myself. Over time, I stopped asking what I wanted and focused on what was expected. It took longer than I care to admit to understand the truth. I was not being measured as a daughter or even as family. I was being assessed for usefulness. Once I saw that, everything else made sense. Some tests are designed so you keep proving your worth, never realizing there was never a way to pass. And that realization settled in just before her health began to fail, changing everything that came next. When Margaret got sick, the house changed. The quiet tension turned into constant motion, appointments, whispered phone calls, long pauses where no one finished their sentences. Daniel became someone else. Fear lived on his face, and I felt needed in a way that felt close to love. I watched him unravel as doctors explained options that sounded temporary and final at the same time. I told myself this was what marriage meant, standing steady when things fell apart. Supporting him felt natural, necessary. Then came the tests. Blood work, scans, more forms than questions. When they told us I was compatible, the word landed heavily between us. No one said what it meant out loud, but it was suddenly everywhere. In the way Daniel held my hand longer, in the way his mother looked at me with something like expectation. I was terrified. I worried about my body, my future, the risks no one could soften. But those fears sat beside something louder, the idea that saying no would make me the reason someone suffered. I told myself love meant showing up when it mattered most. The request didn't arrive as a demand. It arrived wrapped in urgency and hope. I felt chosen and cornered at the same time. What began as care quietly shifted into responsibility. By the time I admitted how little room I had left, the decision no longer felt optional. It felt like the last way to belong. And once that thought settled in, I stopped asking what it would cost me in the end alone. People like to believe sacrifice only happens to the reckless or uninformed. I believed that too, until I was standing inside a decision that felt less like danger and more like purpose. I said yes because hope was louder than fear. Hope that this would finally make me indispensable. Hope that love, once proven, would turn into protection. I was not confused about the risks. I was focused on the meaning I attached to them. For someone who grew up feeling temporary, the idea of being essential is powerful. I told myself that this was what real commitment looked like, that families are built on giving, especially when it hurts. Saying no felt like breaking something fragile that I had waited my whole life to hold. The paperwork came quickly. Forms were placed in front of me while my emotions were already stretched thin. I trusted the process because I trusted the people guiding my hand. Exhaustion softened my questions. Affection filled the silence where caution should have lived. I remember a brief moment of unease, a quiet thought asking whether I truly understood everything I was agreeing to, but I pushed it aside. I chose belief over doubt. That decision was made in hope, not safety. And once it was made, there was no turning back from what my body was about to give. Even then, I believed love would remember me when the pain finally arrived afterward too. When I woke again, the pain had a sharper edge. It wasn't just in my side, but in the way the room felt smaller, colder, wrong. I could barely lift my head. My body was heavy, stitched together, dependent on strangers. Daniel stood near the foot of the bed, not close, not worried. Clean clothes, steady posture, eyes already elsewhere. The distance between us felt deliberate. I searched his face for relief, gratitude, anything familiar, and found nothing waiting for me. Instead, what reached me was finality. Papers placed where my hands could barely move, the weight of them pressed harder than the incision. I understood, slowly, that this was not about recovery. This was about removal. As I lay there bleeding, I was informed that our marriage had been resolved without me, that there was already someone else filling the space I thought I held, that what I had given was the last thing expected of me. The settlement was mentioned like an afterthought, framed as generosity. To me, it sounded like a price tag, a way to close a transaction. I wasn't being supported. I was being erased. I felt humiliation before anger, confusion before grief. My body trembled, but my mind went strangely still. I realized I had never been loved for who I was, only for what I could provide. The most frightening part was not the betrayal itself. It was the moment after, when something inside me stopped asking for mercy, stopped pleading to be chosen. The pain did not explode. It froze. And in that silence, I sensed that whatever came next would no longer be guided by love alone. I stared at the ceiling, aware of footsteps outside the room, unaware yet that this moment was about to be interrupted, that someone else was about to step in and name what had been done to me before I could even understand the damage. When the door opened again, the air changed. The room seemed to tighten around a presence that did not belong to the cruelty unfolding moments earlier. A man in a white coat stepped in, calm, observant, unhurried. His focus moved from my monitors to my face, then to the people standing too confidently beside my bed. I felt the shift before I understood it. The certainty Daniel carried faltered. The performance stopped. What followed didn't sound like comfort. It sounded like correction. I learned that the story I had just been handed was incomplete, that the transplant they spoke about had never happened, that something in the final tests made it impossible to proceed safely. My mind struggled to keep pace as the truth unfolded. The surgery on me was real. The sacrifice was real. But the kidney was never placed where they claimed. Under emergency protocol, it had been reassigned to another patient whose life depended on immediate action. The weight of that realization pressed into me slowly. I had not been discarded because I failed. I had been used because they believed the outcome was guaranteed. The authority in the room did not accuse, it clarified. With that clarity, the balance shifted. Daniel's certainty drained away, and Margaret fell silent. I lay there stunned, aware that my body had saved someone I had never met, and that the truth had stepped in before I could disappear completely alone. I didn't meet him right away. At first, I only felt the effects of his presence. The pace around me changed. Voices softened. Decisions were made without anyone asking what I could still give. I learned that the man who received my kidney was named Richard Hale. He was older, reserved, and very private. What stood out wasn't his wealth or influence, but the way he approached what had happened with restraint. There was no sense of entitlement, no assumption that my sacrifice created a debt I owed him. If anything, he treated it as something that could never be claimed. While I was still weak, I was moved out of that shared ward. The halls grew quieter. The lights were softer. For the first time since waking up, I slept without bracing myself. A nurse spoke to me gently. A door stayed closed unless I asked for it opened. When Richard finally visited, his presence felt steady, not heavy. I didn't feel examined or evaluated. I felt acknowledged. He offered protection, not control. Support, not questions. That difference mattered more than I expected. Safety felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling, but it allowed my body to rest in ways it hadn't yet. No one was waiting for something from me anymore. As I lay there, breathing evenly, I realized survival no longer required vigilance. And in that quiet, a different kind of clarity began to form, one that would soon extend beyond my body and into the life I thought I had lost. Once my body stabilized, attention shifted to details I had been too weak to face. Paperwork surfaced again, but this time it wasn't rushed or emotional. It was careful, quiet, reviewed by people who were not invested in controlling the outcome. That was when I learned the truth about my marriage on paper. During the years I spent trying to belong, Daniel had placed assets in my name, properties, business interests, accounts meant to shield him from risk. I had signed without understanding, trusting that it was routine, that he knew better than I did. When the divorce was pushed through so quickly, he never stopped to reconsider those decisions. In his urgency to remove me, he confirmed them, legally, permanently. At first, I didn't believe it. I assumed there was a mistake, but the more it was explained, the clearer it became. His need for control had created an unintended safeguard. The very structure designed to keep me dependent had given me standing. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I understood the irony without enjoying it. Silence had preserved what arguing never could. Patience had protected me when compliance had not. When I signed the final papers, I did it with full awareness, not out of fear or confusion, but clarity. I wasn't reclaiming something I had lost. I was recognizing something I had never been allowed to see. That moment didn't make me powerful. It made me steady. And steadiness, I would soon learn, was the foundation I needed to become someone who could never be used the same way again. Recovery didn't turn me into someone new overnight. It slowed me down enough to notice who I had been and who I no longer wanted to be. Once the legal fog lifted, I stopped reacting and started learning. I asked questions I used to avoid. I read what I signed. I listened for discomfort instead of explaining it away. Saying no felt awkward at first, like using a muscle that had never been exercised, but each time it grew steadier. I didn't change my life dramatically. I changed it deliberately. I learned how boundaries sound when they're calm instead of apologetic. I learned that discernment is not cruelty, and that protecting myself does not require anger. My posture shifted before my circumstances did. My voice stopped rising at the end of sentences. The biggest change was internal. I stopped measuring my worth by what I could endure or give away. Sacrifice no longer felt like proof of love. It felt like something that should be chosen carefully, not demanded quietly. This phase wasn't revenge. It was rebuilding. Education replaced fear. Awareness replaced hope as a strategy. I became someone who noticed patterns instead of surviving them. By the time I was fully healed, I didn't feel eager to confront the past. I felt prepared. Calm has a weight to it when it's earned, and I could feel that weight settling in. For the first time, I wasn't moving toward anyone else's expectations. I was standing still, clear-eyed, ready to face what remained without raising my voice or my heart rate. I chose the place carefully, a hospital room again, but this time not mine. The air was quiet, clinical, and unforgiving. Daniel sat close to his mother's bed, restless, talking too fast with his hands. I stood still and waited for the noise to exhaust itself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I brought documents, timelines, records that spoke without emotion. I set them down and let the silence do the work. The truth didn't accuse. It aligned. Dates overlapped. Accounts didn't balance. Promises contradicted actions. Their confidence thinned as clarity thickened. What surprised me was my own calm. Fear used to rush me into explanations. Now I felt no urge to rescue anyone from consequences. I watched understanding arrive on their faces, not as remorse, but as inevitability. There was a moment when I sensed they expected something from me. Anger. Forgiveness. A plea to make it easier. I offered none of it. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify boundaries. I simply stopped participating in the old pattern where my pain created comfort for others. Standing there, I realized composure is a form of authority. It doesn't shout. It doesn't persuade. It waits. And when it waits long enough, the truth finds its place. I noticed the room settle, monitors humming, curtains still, decisions no longer suspended. The balance had shifted without spectacle. Accountability doesn't require applause. It requires time, records, and the willingness to step back while consequences arrange themselves quietly and completely. I turned away without ceremony, no final words, no dramatic exit, just distance. As I walked down the hallway, my steps felt lighter, not because justice had finished its work, but because my part was done. What followed would unfold without me, and that was the cleanest ending I could choose. Consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, through paperwork, hearings, quiet conversations that no longer involved me. Assets were frozen, accounts audited, stories adjusted themselves when evidence refused to bend. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a steady calm I hadn't known before. There was no urge to gloat, no desire to witness discomfort. What mattered was that the truth held, even without my presence. Daniel's world narrowed in predictable ways. His mother's influence faded under scrutiny. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just gravity returning to a system that had been distorted for too long. What surprised me most was the absence of joy. Justice felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Necessary, quiet, human. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The tension that once lived in my shoulders released. Sleep came easier. Decisions felt lighter. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped preparing defenses no one was asking for anymore. Closure, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It settles. It leaves room. And in that space, something gentler than triumph formed. 1 year has passed since that hospital room, and my life is quieter now. I wake up without fear, without bracing myself for what I owe anyone. Some mornings I sit by the window, coffee cooling in my hands, and feel something I once thought was impossible. Peace. Healing didn't make me harder. It made me clearer. I learned that love is not proven through sacrifice that destroys you, and belonging should never require you to disappear. My worth was never tied to what I could give away. It was always mine to keep. I still carry scars, physical and emotional, but they no longer define me. They remind me that survival can turn into purpose if you let truth guide you instead of fear. If you've listened this far, thank you for holding this story with me. And if any part of it felt familiar, I hope you know you're not weak for loving deeply. Have you ever had to relearn your value after being used? I read comments.